Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast and also YouTube channel. So it's been another hot minute. This is really becoming a theme where I say like, oh, and I'll make sure it's like regular, and then it never is. Um, but I mean, I always feel like it's been a hectic week, but it's been a hectic week. So one of my deadlines for my masters project is coming up, and so I think it like switched me into hyper stress mode for like 10 seconds, and I feel like much more on top of it now. I also went home for a bit over Easter time, which allowed me to kind of get some rest, which was really nice, step away from things for a bit. But since being back, it's felt quite kind of hyper active and whatever. Oh my nails, look at them. And it's really like wicked core. I get so distracted. Yeah, I think it's just been. Honestly, I think I've been a bit overwhelmed recently as well. A lot of my social media stuff has fallen off a little bit, and I really have to try and get into a habit with, posting on like Instagram stories and TikTok especially is like fallen off the face of the earth. I need to kind of get back into that and making it a habit. Um, Self-deprecation aside, it's nice to be back. I always love filming these and like actually physically doing it. I think it's the planning and the kind of, well, not even the planning, because I think like putting together ideas is really exciting. But I think actually just the idea of sitting down and doing it and starting it is the most difficult part. And I've just been really, really tired recently, and I think I'm running myself down to the ground a little bit. It's been hard. It kind of feels like everything is just blurring into one, and the days are passing me by and all that jazz. But it'll be okay, I'm sure. Just need to give myself some grace. I was gonna say, talking of grace is not even remotely related. So today, I wanted to talk about sex work. So this has mainly been inspired by The White Lotus. So I actually only started watching it like a couple months ago, not that long ago, and I've watched like season one, recently finished season two, and that's the kind of main inspiration for this episode today. I think it forms a really good launching pad for conversations, just generally. I think there's a lot within the White Lotus, kind of a lot of discussion starts in the White Lotus, a lot of themes that could be really meaty, like full episodes on their own. And today, yeah, I'm going to focus on the sex work side of things. But I think that's one of the wonderful things about media as well. I think it allows us to kind of explore these different themes. So I guess without further ado, we can kind of get into it. So it was the characters of Lucia and Mia that sparked this particular idea. Their character development throughout the second series of The White Lotus is really interesting to me, and I think it really starts a conversation on what sex work is or how it is defined in our current culture. So the framing and treatment of sex work overall has shifted over the past few years, and I think there were a few stimuli for this. So firstly, we've got the advent of sex positive feminism. I think that served as a considerable tone shift. It took what was once viewed as a transgression or something to be resorted to as something that could be seen as a taking of agency. I think it's a really complex matter, but an individual's relationship to sex in general, not just sex work, is essential in understanding then how they act towards it. And I also think it important to take the time to understand an individual's perspective before passing a particular judgment. So in The White Lotus, to begin with, Lucia is fully immersed, or at least it seems that is fully immersed in the world of sex work. She, again, at least in how it is presented, is aware of the kind of advantages that it offers her in a kind of societal rung culture kind of manner. The excitement of spending money, the excitement of spending the money of the men who hire her, for example. So when Albie, the young man in the series, when Albie's father kind of steps back from her, she'd been hired, quote unquote, for the entire trip, it seemed. Um, but from a kind of guilt perspective, from his behaviours previously, we're having several affairs. He steps back, and most interestingly, actually, the association with a sex worker for him is like completely abhorrent, both in the frame of his previous activities, but also his standing as a man in the kind of upper rungs of society. So the sex worker here is assumed as a lower being, both financially and also in a gendered way. But we see Lucia's panic here, right? So here we now get an underlying sense of unease. There's a pressure there, both for her own security and also through the fear of the man that she has to answer to. And this all unravels and kind of comes into the fore more as the series goes on. So this illustrates how her perceived control over a situation that we see at the beginning, mimicking kind of the perception of from both her customers and also the hotel staff, is not quite what it seems. I think it's also interesting to consider how the association of her work with the hotel, while it's suggested at one point this is what hotels are for, like this happens all the time in hotels kind of thing. The hotel manager specifically, it very much to begin with seems that they do not want this association because the kind of professional world and this very open and squeaky clean world of the hotel can't gel with sex work and how it is classically perceived. So we don't know why Lucia owes the man who seems to follow her around. Don't know why she owes him money, but it seems that he may be either some sort of pimp or perhaps someone that has enabled her to get to a certain level of comfort in society while still holding the control over her. And this introduces that kind of idea of like Hollywood and how, um, especially like young women, if they want to make it big or whatever, there's that potential for manipulation by like big media bosses. So, notably, we don't know anything of Lucia's early life. And again, this adds that nuance to how she may be seen in her work. And this is something we're going to come on to in that the White Lotus kind of serves as that kind of mini look into society or a little window into people's lives, but you don't really know what's come before and what comes after. So as the series progresses, and when Lucia becomes more involved with Albie, her situation comes more to light. So her previous interactions with his father and then Cameron, the character of Cameron, paint her as a plot device for their personal stories. However, in her relationship with Albie, her personal story comes more to the fore. So notably, she is still an agent of his character development, and this speaks largely to the role of like women and women characters in the media, um, and I guess you could say that character interactions will always serve to develop a character. But this particular matter is obviously shaded in one way. But I think it's also important to note that Albie kind of becomes the savior kind of stereotype. And this does raise the discussion of sex work as something to rise above or be liberated from, quote unquote. It also adds to a larger conversation as well of women in need requiring men, and notably rich men, to save them in a truly kind of Cinderella esque damsel in distress fashion. Lucia seems genuinely happy with Albie, and this feminist kind of argument is not to say that women can't be made to feel safe when they get to know a man. But it's key to consider the ending of the White Lotus and how their relationship kind of fizzles out, where what may have continued is left as a summer romance, whether out of her own alternative ambitions or a fear of commitment or being used to a way of life. One of the things about the White Lotus overall, as I've said, is that you're only seeing these characters in the microcosm of the hotel. You can only imagine what they then go on to. So Mia, on the other hand, has a somewhat reverse journey to her friend. While at the beginning of the series, she's rigidly anti sex work, she does begin to explore it as an option for then furthering her career. So it's by sleeping with a hotel manager, for example, that she lands her gig as piano player and singer in the hotel bar, which has been her aspiration throughout. So this could be viewed in a couple of different ways. So you could say that she's taken agency and got to where she wanted to be through sex work, or that she's had to use what she can to get ahead. I think this is a very personal thing and it's a personal interpretation and personal choice. I don't think we can speak for the character or anyone in reality with our own judgments and our own kind of perceived values and what we would want for ourselves because that's exactly it. It's subjective. It's what we want for us and not necessarily what others want for them. And I think in the world in general, everyone is deserving of respect no matter their profession. So, show business is notorious for its tales of exploitation, with young performers aiming for big jobs and being given little choice otherwise. And I think this is why this conversation is so multi layered, because where does pressure and exploitation and abuse begin and choice end? So, sex positive feminism was not and is not for everyone. I think the message behind it, that kind of female agency over their own bodies, is a good and an essential one. However, like many movements overall, people may use this kind of underlying message or the idea of the of a movement on the surface and interpret it as they wish. Here, then, there's an element of female sexual pleasure, which, again, while important, could be then taken further than just into partner relations. So I'm of the opinion that people should be able to act as they wish, as long as it does not bring harm to others. And I don't think it's my job at all to tell other people that they are too liberal with their bodies and too blasé about sex, or that they're too conservative and prudish, right? I think we often forget that others are also individuals with their own wants and needs and their own complex experiences and personalities. Those perceived as women have been framed throughout time as body first, mind after. And many arguments against this more liberal attitude towards sex is the idea that it only endorses and cements patriarchal attitudes. That stepping into stereotypically feminine traits and showing off your body is a kind of anti feminist tact. But I do think that this is an oversimplification. We've all grown in a patriarchy which dictates everything in a binary fashion, that certain activities and roles are to be fulfilled by men and others by women. But by being cultured into these beliefs, we therefore view behaviours as pro or anti patriarchy, which in itself is a binary. It's furthering the feminist agenda or reinforcing what men want from us. There was a big argument at the time, especially when sex positive feminism was really at its height, that men were benefiting from the movement, which is a generalization in itself because it frames all men as wanting sex, and from women at that. Dangerous people exist everywhere, and it's not on women or on the person to not put the content out there because others, men, will see it and use it for malicious purposes. Ultimately, just existing as someone who is perceived as female in our society puts one to a higher degree of danger from these types of ill-mannered, dangerous, exploitative people. So that is where my kind of more highly scripted stuff ends. Not really very long, actually, as far as like video length goes. And I think I'm really just skirting the surface of this whole argument. However, I think there's some other kind of interesting talking points around sex in the White Lotus, especially season two, generally, and then just generally like societally, etc., etc. So I think the idea of sex versus love can be brought in a lot. Um, Interestingly, so you've got Albie's father and then Albie's grandfather, and the attitudes of each of the generations is actually a really interesting thing to consider. So Albie is almost hyper aware of like the meaning of sex and what it is, and he seems much more naive. And then his father has had, you know, these several affairs and this kind of idea of being a sex addict. And then his grandfather is very, very open in the way of like, yeah, like um I feel attracted to women all the time and I feel aroused all the time. He's quite open about it. And I think it's interesting to consider kind of generationally how and why they kind of think this way. Um, and, you know, I mean, this comes along with kind of shifting attitudes towards women and relationships and things in society. You know, Albie challenges what his grandfather does and says, right? Um, and I also think it interesting to maybe think of it from the other perspective, in that not the kind of disrespect or seeing women as an object way, but more from that it's okay to desire. And I think that, you know, this isn't to say that kind of our more modern attitudes of, you know, women get a choice, women aren't just objects for male sexual pleasure is wrong, because that is very true. But I also think sometimes that maybe men are afraid of expressing that they find a woman attractive or they're sexually attracted to a woman because they then may be perceived as a misogynist. And obviously, there is a layer of how these things are expressed. You can still be attracted to somebody and be respectful. And, you know, I think there's a layer of like, there's the other side of the coin, right? So women throughout time, those perceived as female, have not been kind of respected in the way of having getting pleasure from sex and having desires and wants and needs. And so now that they kind of can express what they want and it's more widely socially accepted, perhaps then we should also be accountable as we should also be accountable for how we talk about men that we may desire. You know, I think that this respect thing goes both ways. And I think that, well, I say both ways, that's a very binary way of thinking. I think this respect thing should go from anyone to anyone else. I think you can express that you find somebody attractive while still respecting them as an individual. I think a lot of the time we forget that the people around us are all individuals. And, you know, while we may be the kind of main character in our own story, everyone else is also the main character in theirs. And I don't know. I don't know whether that came across very well. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that while Albie is right to challenge his grandfather's views, and I think it right to challenge views when it's safe to, and to start conversations like this, I can also appreciate that you should and can and you are able to express desire in conversation, call a woman beautiful without then fearing repercussions. You should be able to do that, I think. So there's also the character of Portia, and I find Portia's relationship with Jack quite interesting in this way. So Portia, from a kind of other side of the coin of that female agency, is seeking thrill, right? She's seeking thrill, she's seeking fun, and that comes in the form of Jack. I think this speaks to, you can kind of see Portia and Lucia on a similar level, right, in this way. So the thrill that Lucia gets from getting the money from her work is that thrill that Portia seeks when she goes out partying and is more kind of frivolous, to use a word like that, with Jack. When she finds Albie, he's kind of the safe, the good guy, finds him quite boring. And I think that the White Lotus does a nice job of showing female agency while also showing the dangers of following people to the ends of the earth, right? And I think that it served as a nice warning as well, that there is danger all about and that people can not quite be what they seem. And so in Portia's case, she has that agency over her own body and she trusts Jack and she is manipulated, right? And so is Tanya. Oh my God, that was tragic as hell. I was like, no, no. Anyway, spoilers. But and I think that considering Jack's relationship with sex as well is interesting because I wonder that I I don't know whether this is my bias towards Leo Woodall as Dexter in One Day, right? Oh my God, it's come back. It's come back to me one day. But considering the character of Jack in isolation, I wonder if he does. It's clear that he's been with Portia to get her away so that they can bump off Tanya, right? Who is his uncle, quote unquote, can bump off Tanya. But I wonder whether he does truly like Portia. I think I think he probably does, but I also think that he's so incredibly damaged and obviously he was in a very dark place and got wrapped up in the situation with his uncle where he has to have sex with him and all of these things. He gets locked into that, and so that means that he has no freedom realistically in what he wants to do. And there's the money question and all of that, the being taken from a dark place and being offered comfort, being taken up the rungs of society and integrated with the upper classes and the rich and comfort and all of the things that that kind of lifestyle is associated with. And so it's interesting to draw correlations between Jack and Lucia and seeing how with Lucia and the man that she owes and Jack and his quote uncle, how those relationships are so very similar. They just are presented in slightly different ways. They both get to live the quote unquote high life, but there is that danger beneath it. And I think perhaps by staying and not going with Albie and by it ending, that shows how Lucia is also trapped in the cycle. But I also think it important to then reflect here that sex work is not necessarily always like this, and that some people choose to do it. I think things like OnlyFans, which is a different level of sex work. I think that the sex work isn't a very overarching term, but I think it's important to respect people for those choices, But then specifically in the White Lotus, how it's presented is that, Lucia's offered a way out, right? If she wants it, and she doesn't. And so she doesn't take it. And I think it's important to, no matter what you think, respect her for that decision because it's her decision to make and it's her body. I think, there's an argument for maybe offering people a different way, letting them see different things. But like I say, if it's their choice, it's their choice. And I think that, as I say, everyone deserves respect for that. So, conclusions. It's been a bit of a shorter one. I think this is only going to come to about half an hour, if 25 minutes. Um, but I think that's nice sometimes, to have something a little bit shorter, kind of medium length. But also, I think this is only the beginning. I think there's a lot that you can say within this conversation. And I think generally, I guess my overarching and general opinion is that on sex work itself, is that I'm not going to demonize somebody for doing sex work because realistically, that's not my place. Um, and I think there's so much complexity to it. There's so many reasons why people do sex work. And I think just having these discussions is a really important and good way to frame it differently because I think sex work has always been looked down upon. As I say, it's been seen as a transgression, and I think that that isn't necessarily the case. And I think also viewing things in such a negative light is not helpful for those who want to try different things, but it's also not helpful for those who have sex work as their profession because you can't just demonize somebody for one element of their personality or one element of their person. Like I say, everyone is an individual with their own complexities and experiences and personalities. And as I say, I think it's important to remember that. So, yeah, please let me know what you think. Overall, The White Lotus as well. I've just started watching season 3. I've watched the first 2 episodes, so I'm slightly, behind, whatever. I haven't seen any spoilers yet because I'm not that chronically online, hence the absence of social media presence. So, we'll see. I'm avoiding. But, yeah, I hope that was interesting. I hope my thoughts came across clearly. We'll see in the edit, and right now I will be nodding or shaking my head or just praying that it's okay. Um, yeah, I think, I mean, I say I want to try and make this more of a regular thing, but I say that every time. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, and any feedback would be much appreciated as well. I know that I feel like I'm umming and ahhing a lot. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot. Um, but we'll see. We'll see. And yeah, I'm just really tired, and so is everyone. So, I'm not special. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I should give myself a bit of a break. I say that, but I want to do more of this, so we'll see. But yeah, have a nice week, 2 weeks, however long it may be. Week, hopefully, a few days even. Wow. Um, have a nice time, everyone. And I hope you will return to listening to this podcast soon. Take care, and let's keep talking.